The forest didn't hum anymore. It crackled. It whispered in ash. It smelled like loss. Eli stood at the edge of what used to be green and alive, where moss once padded every step and birds greeted the sun. Now, it was a graveyard of blackened trunks and scorched soil stretching in every direction. Just a month ago, this stretch of Oregon wilderness had been untouched. Now it was a wound the size of a town. He lifted his camera and took another photo. Not for memories. For documentation. Evidence of what was lost, and maybe someday, what would return. The wildfire had taken almost everything: nests, dens, undergrowth, and silence. It had moved fast, fed by dry winds and forgotten warnings. Families were evacuated. Animals scattered. Some never made it out. Eli knew. He'd found them, the remains. But this morning, something pulled him back here. Not duty. Not science. Something else. He moved slowly through the skeletons of trees, boots crunching ash and frost. His breath was visible, clouds rising in the early morning chill. A crow flew overhead, the only bird brave enough to return to a place so haunted. And then, he heard it. Not the wind. Not falling branches. A sound. Soft. Desperate. Wounded. A cry. Eli froze. The sound came again, not loud, but unmistakable. Like a baby. He turned, following the faint whimper through the charred maze, past stumps that still smoked in their cores. The closer he got, the more certain he became. It wasn't human. But it was hurting. He pushed past a fallen log, eyes scanning the debris. Then he saw it. At the base of a scorched pine, barely standing, was a bear cub. Its fur was matted with soot, singed in places, its paws raw and pink against the cold earth. Its head was low, shoulders trembling. One side of its body was slick with a smear of dried blood. The tree behind it was burned hollow, a black cave of what once might have been a den. Eli dropped to his knees instinctively, breath catching. The cub looked up. Eyes wide. Wet. Terrified. And still, it didn't run. "Hey buddy," Eli whispered, voice breaking. "You're not supposed to be here." Neither am I, he thought. He slowly took off his jacket, inching closer across the ash. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you." The cub gave a weak grunt, trying to push itself up, but its hind legs buckled. It collapsed again with a pitiful whimper. Eli's hands trembled as he wrapped the jacket around the tiny body, lifting it gently. The cub didn't fight, just lay limp, breathing raggedly against his chest. The smell of smoke still clung to its fur. As he cradled the cub, a strange thing happened. Tears rose in his eyes. He hadn't cried in months. Not since the accident. Not since he buried the dog who had followed him through these same woods for 8 years. The dog who had once barked at every bear, then grew old enough to sleep beside one. "You're lucky, little guy," he whispered. "Someone wanted you to live." The cub gave a faint huff. Eli stood, turning back toward the trail, toward help. He didn't know then what the cub had lost. He didn't know this moment would start something neither of them could undo. He only knew one thing. He wasn't going to leave it behind. Eli had driven faster than he should have. The snow on the road to the wildlife rehab center was just beginning to melt, leaving patches of slush that made the tires slip. But he didn't slow down. Every time the bear cub whimpered in the back seat, bundled in his flannel jacket and cradled in an old sleeping bag, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. When he arrived, the staff rushed out to meet him, surprised by the urgency on his face. "It's a cub," he said, stepping aside as they opened the back door. "Found it near the burned ridge." The moment the vet techs lifted the little creature out, a soft hush fell over them. The cub was trembling, barely holding on. "It's a miracle he survived," one of them whispered. "Or someone wanted him to," Eli muttered under his breath. They kept the cub in a temperature-controlled room, wrapped in blankets, administering fluids and ointments. Eli stayed longer than necessary, pacing the hallway, checking the window, tapping his foot as if that would help. Hours passed. Finally, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Marin stepped out, wiping her hands on a towel. "He's stable," she said. "Dehydrated, some burns, minor respiratory distress. But he's a fighter." "Will he make it?" Eli asked. She gave him a small smile. "He already has." They kept the cub under observation for the first week. He didn't eat much, but he wasn't rejecting food either. He mostly slept, curled up in the same bundle Eli had first wrapped him in. They didn't know how long he'd been alone. From the size of his paws, Maren guessed he was about 6 months old. Old enough to follow his mother. Young enough to still need her. She didn't survive. That much was clear. The burns on the cub's side, the uneven pattern, the deeper protection on one flank, suggested she'd shielded him from the fire with her own body. He stayed beside her after, Maren explained, until hunger forced him to move. That's probably why you found him near the den. He didn't know where else to go. Eli didn't respond. He couldn't. He'd lost someone, too. His old dog Scout had died just weeks earlier from cancer. A companion through every hike, every river crossing, every forest trail. Scout had gone silent in her final days, curled at Eli's feet, refusing to leave his side. Just like this cub had stayed beside his mother. The center let Eli name him. Cinder, he said. The name came too easily. For the ashes he came from, and the fire he survived. Cinder responded to the name with a soft huff the first time Eli said it. See. Maren laughed. He likes you. It wasn't long before Cinder began perking up whenever Eli entered the room. The cub would grunt, shuffle to the edge of his pen, and paw gently at the glass until Eli came close. Sometimes he'd press his forehead against the barrier, eyes closing like it was the only comfort he knew. Eli started bringing things, pine cones, bits of tree bark, sticks shaped like forks. Cinder would bat them around, his energy slowly returning. He started eating better. First from a bowl. Then by hand. By the second week, Eli had pulled a mattress into the office next to Cinder's recovery enclosure. He pretended it was just to help the staff, easier to be close in case of emergency. But really, he just didn't want to leave. And neither did Cinder. Late one night, as snow fell quietly outside the window, Eli sat beside the enclosure, sketching the cub in a notebook. The soft scratching of pencil was the only sound in the room. Suddenly, a soft thump. Cinder had reached up and dropped a pine cone into Eli's lap through the feeding slot. The man blinked. A gift. Thanks, little guy, he said with a chuckle, voice catching in his throat. It was the first time he'd smiled, really smiled, in months. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted in patches, uncovering blackened ground and water-soaked roots, but life stirred beneath the surface. Buds pushed their way out of scorched branches. Birds returned in small flocks. And at the rehab center, something just as fragile, and just as brave, was blooming. Cinder was growing. He had gained weight, strength, and curiosity. His coat had thickened into a soft caramel brown, though the fur on his left shoulder never quite grew back, a permanent mark of the fire that nearly took him. And wherever Eli went, Cinder watched. Like a shadow with paws. They began supervised outdoor walks in the enclosed meadow behind the center. Cinder would step cautiously at first, sniffing the damp earth and spring air. But once he felt safe, he'd roll onto his back, legs flailing, as if claiming the ground for himself. Eli brought toys, logs to climb, balls to bat, even ropes to tug. Cinder responded like a clumsy puppy, bounding toward him with excited grunts. But it wasn't just play. There were moments in between. Quiet ones. When Eli would sit against a tree stump and Cinder would rest his head near his lap, eyes half closed, like the weight of the world had finally eased. Eli had been warned by the staff. "You're getting attached," Maren said gently one afternoon, watching them through the fence. He didn't deny it. Because it was already true. Back inside, Cinder would paw at the glass until Eli came into the room. The cub hated being separated, pacing and grumbling until he could fall asleep hearing Eli's breathing nearby. One evening, Eli entered the enclosure barefoot, crouched low, and sat on the floor without a word. Cinder ambled up beside him, sniffed his knee, then curled up beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Eli let out a slow breath and whispered, "You miss her, don't you?" The cub didn't move. Just sighed, heavy and low. "I miss someone too." There was a journal Eli kept, tucked in the side pocket of his old ranger backpack. It was originally meant for tracking wildlife patterns, weather changes, and rare sightings. But since the fire, the pages had changed. Now it held drawings of a cub playing in ash, photos of pine cones left as gifts, notes about Cinder's sleeping habits and favorite snacks. But also entries like, "He nudged the door closed behind me today. He curled around my boots like Scout used to. I don't know how I'll let him go." As Cinder grew stronger, the team began evaluating his readiness for release. It was standard practice. Black bears could usually be reintroduced if they were young and avoided imprinting on humans. But everyone saw it, the way Cinder responded only to Eli. The way his ears perked when he heard his voice. The way he pressed against the gate whenever Eli left. "He's not just surviving because of you," Marin told him. "He's living." The release forms sat untouched in Eli's inbox for weeks. Each time he opened them, a knot formed in his stomach. How do you prepare to lose someone twice? One afternoon, as Eli sat near the back gate of the enclosure sketching, Cinder dragged something across the dirt. A thick tree branch, slightly singed at one end. He dropped it beside Eli and looked up, expectantly. "You wanna play fetch now?" Eli asked with a dry laugh. Cinder huffed and nudged the stick again. Eli looked closer. The branch was from the same kind of tree where Cinder had been found. It still smelled faintly of smoke. The message was clear, even if Cinder couldn't say it. He remembered. At night, Eli would reread the journal and pause at a sentence he'd written but never meant to share. "This bear saved me." It happened on a Thursday. The morning began like any other. Soft mist curling over the treetops. A faint drizzle darkening the earth. Cinder pacing excitedly as Eli approached the enclosure with breakfast in hand, sliced apples and soaked oats, his favorite. But something was off. Cinder didn't meet him at the gate. No cheerful grunt. No bouncing paws or nudging nose. Just silence. Eli's steps quickened. He entered the enclosure and scanned the area. The door to the outdoor run stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. His stomach dropped. "Cinder," he called. No answer. He jogged to the far side of the fence line. The outer gate was still latched, secure. But a section of the wire mesh, near the base, had been torn open. Not by a human. Claw marks. The tracks in the mud told the rest of the story. Cinder had left. On his own. Panic swept over Eli like a flood. It wasn't time. Cinder wasn't ready. He wasn't ready. The rehab team was notified immediately. A search plan was launched. Trail cameras were activated. A volunteer reported movement near the northern woods the night before, but it could have been anything. Eli didn't wait. He grabbed his coat, a map, his flashlight, and the notebook Cinder had once pawed at. He headed straight into the woods. For days, he searched. He called Cinder's name until his voice cracked. He left bits of food and scent markers at familiar trees. He checked the old clearing, the place where he had first found the cub, beside the burned-out den. Empty. Not even paw prints. He slept in the truck, boots caked with mud, notebook pages folded with fresh notes of disappointment. No sign near creek. Rain washed the trail. Left scarf on the ridge. Come back tomorrow. I shouldn't have let him get so close to the fence. The staff tried to reassure him. He's older now. Maybe he knew it was time. But Eli knew Cinder. He wouldn't just leave. Not without a reason. Then came the dream. On the fourth night, exhausted from hiking and barely awake, Eli dozed off in the truck. He dreamt of the fire. Of ashes swirling like snow. Of a cub pressing against a blackened tree, crying softly. But this time, when Eli reached out, the cub didn't cry. It looked up at him and walked away. Toward something. Not running. Not afraid. Following something he couldn't see. When Eli awoke, the message was still burning in his mind. Cinder had left for a reason. On the fifth day, just after dawn, Eli found something. Near the edge of the old fire line, under a fallen log, a small pile of pine cones. Arranged neatly. Deliberately. A single singed twig sat on top. Cinder's language. His heart raced. He wasn't gone. He was trying to be found. Eli crouched by the pine cones, heart hammering. He touched the charred twig on top, still faintly warm from the morning sun. The way they were placed, not scattered, not random, reminded him of the way Cinder used to slide objects toward him. Gifts. Messages. I'm here. Eli looked around. The forest was quiet, the snow only a thin veil now. No paw prints, no fresh signs, but the signal was clear. Cinder hadn't just wandered off. He was circling back. He was leaving clues. Eli followed a hunch. He traced a loop on the map, a slow arc that curved from the rehab center toward the far western edge of the burn zone, and then back again to the river trail. It was close to where Cinder had been rescued, where his mother had died. He marked the spots where pine cones had shown up before, playfully gifted during mealtimes, tucked into the corners of his enclosure, once even dropped in Eli's lap like an offering. And then he saw it. The curve. Cinder wasn't lost. He was going home. The next morning, Eli set out before dawn. He traced a loop on the map, a slow arc that curved from the rehab center toward the far western edge of the burn zone, and then back again to the river trail. It was close to where Cinder had been rescued, where his mother had died. He marked the spots where pine cones had shown up before, playfully gifted during mealtimes, tucked into the corners of his enclosure, once even dropped in Eli's lap like an offering. And then he saw it. The curve. Cinder wasn't lost. He was going home. The next morning, Eli set out before dawn. He brought only what mattered: a water flask, a protein bar, his notebook, and a small bundle wrapped in cloth, Cinder's old red collar from the clinic. It had his name stitched in faded thread. He hiked for hours through the recovering forest, where patches of green peeked through ash like hope rebuilding itself. Around midday, he reached the clearing. The one from before. The burned tree. The grave-like depression in the soil where Cinder had once curled in grief. It looked the same, and completely different. Vines had begun to grow up the broken trunks. Wildflowers pushed through the cracks. But something else had changed. A trail. Barely visible, but present, indentations in the soft earth leading from the edge of the woods directly to the center of the clearing. And in the middle, a mound of leaves. A soft pile of sticks and pine cones. Eli froze. It was a nest. Not for sleeping, but for remembering. A shrine. Cinder had been returning here. Again and again. Not for shelter. For her. Eli stepped into the clearing and sat beside the mound. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. The wind moved through the trees above like a lullaby. Sunlight dappled through the charred branches. Everything was still. He reached into his pack and laid the red collar gently on top of the pile. "For you," he whispered. Because he never forgot. Then he closed his eyes. And listened. A low sound carried through the woods. Not a growl. Not a threat. A familiar huff. Eli turned slowly, barely daring to breathe. From the edge of the trees, a large bear emerged. No longer the tiny cub who once cried beside a tree. Cinder. His fur had grown thick, his body strong, but the eyes were the same, warm, watchful, full of quiet knowing. He didn't charge. Didn't flinch. He stepped forward, stopping just a few feet away. He looked down at the pile of pine cones, then back at Eli. And for a moment, the world stood still. Eli didn't reach for him. He didn't have to. The bond was still there, not in touch, but in trust. A silent understanding. Then Cinder did something Eli didn't expect. He reached forward with his snout, and nudged the red collar gently toward the center of the nest. As if completing the circle. As if saying, "This was always where I needed to be." For the longest time, neither of them moved. Eli sat still, knees in the mossy ash, while Cinder stood tall beside the pile of pine cones, the tribute they now shared. Between them hung the silence of the forest, no longer lifeless, but listening. The wind shifted gently through the trees, and above them, a hawk cried out, a call that echoed sharp and distant. Cinder lowered himself slowly, as if not to startle the moment, and curled beside the mound where his mother once lay. His body, massive now, coiled protectively around it. He glanced at Eli, not for permission, but in recognition. "I see you," Eli whispered. And he did. Not as a rescue. Not as a memory. But as something whole. The little cub who once cried beside a burned tree had grown into a force of the forest, strong, wild, and yet somehow still that same soul who once pressed a pine cone into his hand. Eli didn't stay long. He knew this wasn't his place anymore. It never really had been. As he stood, Cinder's eyes followed him, soft and still. "I'll come back," Eli said, voice cracking. Not to take you. Just to visit. He pulled the notebook from his coat and carefully tore out one page, a sketch of Cinder's face from that first week, barely healed, eyes wide and tired. He weighed it down with a stone on the pinecone mound. A keepsake. A goodbye. And then he turned and walked away. Cinder didn't follow. That's how Eli knew everything was right. Back at the rehab center, Eli gave Marin the report, where he'd found Cinder, how he'd looked, what he'd done. He's wild now, Eli said, a strange smile forming. But he remembers. She nodded. So will you. Months passed. Seasons changed. And once each year, near the anniversary of the fire, Eli returned to that same clearing. He never stayed long. Sometimes he brought pine cones. Other times, he brought just himself and silence. Not every visit ended in a sighting. But once, deep in the fall, when the leaves were gold and the air sharp, he arrived to find something new. A fresh pine cone in the middle of the nest. Beside it, one of the red threads from the old collar, now frayed with age. A message. Still here. Still remembered. Eli knelt down and smiled, tears rising as he whispered, "You saved me too, you know." Then from the edge of the woods, a soft huff. Low and calm. Cinder. Not to stay. Not to be touched. Just to be seen. As Eli stood to leave, he glanced back one last time. The bear stood silhouetted in the orange light of the dying day, strong and still beside the burned tree that once held only pain, and now memory. And Eli realized something simple and true. Some bonds don't need words. Some goodbyes don't end anything. And sometimes, a broken beginning becomes the most unforgettable ending of all.